When you stand with Israel, you stand for your own values.
If the deal isn't done before I take office, all hell will break out.
The world is being fundamentally transformed. The old rules-based order is finished, but a new one has not yet emerged.
Welcome back. It is currently election season in Canada. People are calling this the election of our lifetime. While this is true, it is not for the reasons Canadians think it is. Currently, most Canadian media has framed this election as a vote for the leader best suited to take on Trump and his broad-based 25% tariffs, which will go into effect April 1st. The irony is that they barely mention the fact that China has imposed massive tariffs on Canada's agriculture sector. It's true, Canada's next Prime Minister will definitely have to stand up to Trump. However, this election has less to do with Trump's damaging tariffs and everything to do with Canada's sovereignty. I'm going to show you why Mark Carney and the Liberal Party are bigger threats to Canada's sovereignty than Trump's tariffs. Just a quick recap of the past 2 months. Justin Trudeau resigned as Liberal Party leader in January, driven by his rock-bottom approval ratings. He had become the most unpopular Prime Minister in Canadian history, handing massive edge to the Conservative Party's Pierre Poilievre. Trudeau also prorogued the government. For those not familiar with the term, he essentially hit the reset button on Canada's political system. Magically, when the Canadian political system turned back on, a new operating system was installed. Justin Trudeau 2.0, aka Mark Carney. Carney was elected as the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada on March 9th, 2025, and was sworn in as the 24th Prime Minister of Canada on March 14th, replacing Justin Trudeau. Mark Carney was not elected by Canadians to lead Canada. He was selected by a very small number of people in the Liberal Party. Is this legal? Absolutely. Is it fair? Not really. And that's why Mark Carney decided to call an election before government returned to Parliament in order to earn his title as legitimate Prime Minister of Canada. The decision to remove Trudeau from office and to prorogue the government during a trade war with the United States was a risky one, but it actually worked out for the Liberal Party of Canada. The media put the focus on Donald Trump and his trade war rather than on Trudeau and his failed policies. Now that Canadians are scared of the big orange boogeyman down south, the Liberals under Mark Carney have surged in the polls and are even projected to win more seats than the Conservatives. The last 9 years under Justin Trudeau have been a massive experiment in post-nationalism. At least that's how Trudeau defined it in 2015. Trudeau said that Canada would be the first post-national state. In other words, he was suggesting a vision of Canada that moves beyond traditional notions of nationhood, rooted in a singular unifying identity. He stated, "There is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada," and emphasized instead a set of shared values such as openness, respect, compassion, willingness to work hard, equity, and justice as the foundation of this new model. That sounds lovely and utopian, but the problem is, like many socialist and communist experiments of the past, it only works if everyone else is doing it, and even then, they're doing it wrong. Trudeau's post-nationalism put Canadian national interests on the back burner, which has allowed Canada to become a weak country wide open to infiltration and exploitation. In other words, Canada's sovereignty has been eroded. Here's a simple definition of sovereignty. A sovereign state is a politically independent entity with full authority over its own territory, population, and government, free from external control. I'll show you 3 instances where Canada's sovereignty has weakened under Justin Trudeau's leadership and explain why I believe Mark Carney's leadership would likely follow a similar path. First, let's talk about Canada's military. Canada's military is objectively in shambles. It suffers from a chronic lack of funding, which translates into military weakness. For instance, the Royal Canadian Navy operates a dilapidated fleet of 12 frigates, averaging 30 years old, which is also, by the way, their service life, with no plan to replace them. This fleet represents 35% of Canada's Navy. Meanwhile, the Air Force still relies on CF-18 fighter jets from the 1980s, supplemented by second-hand F-18s from Australia, while awaiting the delayed F-35 deliveries, which are not expected until 2026, and even that is now in question. Why doesn't Canada just replace these outdated military assets? Because the Trudeau government hasn't allocated any money to the military. Even if there were money to buy new jets and ships, there wouldn't be any personnel to operate and fix them. The Canadian Armed Forces faces a severe recruitment crisis with a shortfall of about 16,000 personnel, 15% below readiness goals, as annual enlistment continues to drop. A 2024 Department of National Defense report revealed that just 58% of pledged military units could deploy for NATO missions if called upon. Trudeau's defense spending is about 1.29% of GDP, far below the NATO 2% target. If Canada wanted to meet the target today, they would need to spend about $81 billion just to catch up. Canada's current budget deficit is about $50 billion. So where does that extra money come from? If Trump wanted to roll in and take over Canada tomorrow, he could. Canadians aren't even allowed to own guns for the purposes of self-defense. Don't even get me started on that. Trudeau's post-nationalism has left Canada defenseless, unable to protect its own borders, let alone offer protection to allied countries. Will Mark Carney be any different? Well, he says he'll increase defense spending to the 2% NATO target, but he's on the campaign trail right now, and there's no way to know if he'll actually do it. Considering the fact that he's been advising the Trudeau government since August of 2020 and looking at the state of Canada's military right now, it's safe to say that Carney doesn't actually think about national security as a top priority. In February of 2023, Canadian Security and Intelligence Services, also known as CSIS, concluded that the Chinese government interfered in the 2019 and 2021 elections. CSIS highlighted the presence of unauthorized Chinese police stations in Canada, allegedly operated by the Chinese Communist Party to monitor and intimidate Chinese nationals to vote in a certain way. In May 2024, an official probe by Parliament's Foreign Interference Commission found that China interfered in both elections and that Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party was made aware of this in an official briefing but has denied knowing anything about it. Later in October, Justin Trudeau testified that he was aware of the foreign interference in Canada's election, including specific parliamentarians that were involved, but kept a detailed list classified, citing national security constraints. Keeping the list classified has drawn widespread criticism as a political move, because it's really hard to imagine a national leader not wanting to get to the bottom of election interference. With a little help from government-funded media, Trudeau was able to flip the script and sway the narrative against Pierre Poilievre.
There are foreign countries trying to interfere in our elections.
The public inquiry into
foreign interference
has just released its final report.
Our national security agencies have confirmed this. But for some reason, Pierre Poilievre refuses to listen to them.
Pierre Poilievre, whose job as opposition leader is to keep the government accountable, could not have exposed this secret list of individuals threatening Canada's sovereignty if he had his security clearance. Unfortunately, confused voters have been swayed by the spin. They now think Pierre is the shady one and has something to hide. Head in the sand doesn't even begin to describe what's going on here in Canada. Unfortunately for Canada, Trudeau's decision to prorogue the government means that Canadians will never know the extent of Chinese interference or which parliamentarians were involved in undermining Canada's election integrity until there is a new government in place. Take a look at this incident, which happened this past January, but is only being discovered now. Liberal candidate Paul Chiang, seeking re-election at Markham Unionville, recently spoke openly about a $1 million bounty placed by Hong Kong police on Joe Tay, a conservative candidate at Don Valley North. Speaking to a group of Chinese journalists, he said this: "To everyone here, you can claim the $1 million bounty if you bring him to Toronto's Chinese consulate." To be clear, a Canadian member of parliament and former police officer is openly calling for his rival to be arrested by a foreign government. And what is Mark Carney's response as of March 31st? Crickets. Forget all the other scandals. This story alone should have Canadians protesting in the streets. Sadly, Canadians have become numb to the scandals and they've grown accustomed to a government that isn't held accountable for their actions. So why get worked up about these stories anyways? The lack of government accountability and the complacent attitude towards the Chinese Communist Party's activities in Canada has led to the erosion of Canadian sovereignty. Regardless of what you may think of Pierre Poilievre's refusal to renew his security clearance, the one person who was able to ensure Canada's election integrity and crack down on foreign interference was Justin Trudeau, who unfortunately is not known for having integrity. Will Mark Carney be any different? If he cares about election integrity, cracking down on foreign interference, and building up trust among disenfranchised Canadians, he should rebuke Paul Chiang for his despicable comments and disqualify him from racing as a Liberal candidate. There are over a dozen scandals, either directly or indirectly related to Trudeau and his government, that highlight this we're above the law, ivory tower mindset that has stained the underpants of the Liberal Party forever. But there is one stain to rule them all: invoking the Emergencies Act during the trucker convoy on Parliament Hill. Trudeau's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act and freeze bank accounts was a blatant government overreach that shocked the world. Current Prime Minister and then advisor to the Trudeau government, Mark Carney, called the Freedom Convoy sedition and endorsed the use of these extreme measures such as freezing bank accounts. He wrote in the Globe and Mail, "Those who are still helping to extend this occupation must be identified and punished to the full force of the law. Drawing the line means choking off the money that financed this occupation." He continues on to say, "But by now, anyone sending money to the convoy should be in no doubt. You are funding sedition." Marco Mendicino, who is now Mark Carney's chief of staff and back then was the Minister of Public Safety, said this, "We invoked the act because it was the advice of nonpartisan professional law enforcement." Later, it was found out that not a single police or intelligence agency had ever petitioned the federal government to invoke the Emergencies Act. Not the Ottawa Police, not the Ontario Provincial Police, and not the RCMP. The Mounties, in fact, had actively advised against it. Brenda Lucky, the RCMP's then commissioner, told Mendicino's office on the eve of the Act's invocation that existing legislation was sufficient to clear the Ottawa blockades. The government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act was challenged in court, and on January 23, 2024, Federal Court Justice Richard Mosley issued his ruling on Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act. He wrote, "I have concluded that the decision to issue the proclamation does not bear the hallmarks of reasonableness, justification, transparency, and intelligibility, and was not justified in relation to the relevant factual and legal constraints that were required to be taken into consideration." To be clear, Judge Mosley found no reasonable grounds existed to classify the convoy as a national security threat, and the situation wasn't a critical nationwide crisis unmanageable by other Canadian laws, contrary to government claims. The ruling is under appeal by the federal government, but Mosley's decision marks a significant rebuke of Trudeau's government overreach, something that Mark Carney was a part of. Canada is now known as the country who freezes its own citizens' bank accounts, something usually reserved for terrorists or for dictatorships. Mark Carney is torn from the same elitist cloth as Trudeau. He is a champion of globalist policies and ideologies that center around more government control and less freedom of choice for individuals. This has led to an overall weakness here at home. There is no real fiscal plan to increase military spending. There is no indication that he'll expose foreign interference and cut ties with the CCP. And even though the media is trying to paint him as a man of the people, I would say that it's very unlikely that, if elected, he will climb down from his ivory tower to become one of us.
People will charge me as being elitist or a globalist, to use that term, which is, well, that's exactly, it happens to be exactly what we need.
I disagree. Voting for Mark Carney is the same as voting for Trudeau. When you go to the ballot box, remember what this election is actually about: restoring government accountability, putting Canadian national interests ahead of globalist policies, and defending Canada's sovereignty.